you very much. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Franco Zappettini. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Sciences at La Sapienza in Rome, as well as a senior research fellow at the University of Liverpool. So today's session is on Brexit, as we've been told, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the format already, which involves a 40-minute lecture by Professor Calhoun, and then a series of parallel small group discussions, and finally a general Q&A session. So we'll aim to finish by 4:30, if I'm correct. Okay, so I was asked to give a 5-minute introduction on the topic of Brexit by looking at populist dynamics from an international relations perspective. And I must say that quite a lot has been said and written on the populist nature of Brexit. And I'm sure that Professor Calhoun will provide further inspiring insights into this with his lecture. So my considerations here today, I think, are more on the legacy of Brexit. I'm a discourse analyst, and I've worked on the topic of Brexit for the last 8 years by looking at discourses surrounding this particular phenomenon. And as I've argued in a forthcoming paper for critical discourse studies, I think we need to be looking at discursive trajectories, such as the populist impetus that drove Brexit, from a larger historical perspective. Because Brexit didn't happen overnight. It was rather the combination of historical discourses, for example, of the relationship between the UK and the continent, discourses of the British exceptionalism, as well as, a particular Thatcherian vision of the EU as a trading bloc rather than a political union. And in a sense, all these discourses had already pre-legitimized Brexit well before the term was even coined, this at least in public opinion. And then, of course, we had the populist mobilization by UKIP and the big media campaign, which resulted in the referendum outcome. So despite claims that Brexit has been done, really, I think the UK is still very much dealing with the uncertainties and the consequences of leaving the EU. There are many open questions. We have the question of the Irish border and the possible Irish reunification. We have still open the question of the Scottish independence. We have questions around trade issues, which are still impacting on the British economy and many others. And crucially, I think what we have today still present in public discourse is that kind of nationalist sentiment that fuels the Leave vote. Because if you take, for example, the Rwanda bill that's been discussed, for the last 2 years now, and the way it has been legitimized by the Conservative government has been on the wake of the taking back control of border immigration slogan, which clearly is a discursive legacy of Brexit. And this is only the internal dimension of Brexit. Then we have the external dimension of Brexit, because again, much of the so-called domino effect that had been anticipated soon after the referendum outcome didn't really materialize, because no mainstream European party picked up on the British example. Yes, we've seen the rise of populist and right-wing parties, but their relationship with the EU has been much more ambivalent, and shaped by convenience, if you like. So maybe I'm just suggesting that this is something that we need to reflect on, as well as looking at the causes of Brexit in the first place. But I'm looking at time, and I'm aware that I've talked a lot, so enough of me talking now. I'm going to leave the floor to Professor Craig Calhoun, who is a distinguished interdisciplinary scholar. He's now a professor of social sciences at Arizona State University. Previously, he served as president and director of the LSE, London School of Economics, and as well as the president of the Social Science Research Council and president of the Berggruen Institute. He's also worked in different American and international institutions, as well as a visiting professor. Not to mention that he's published 9 books and over 150 peer-reviewed papers. So his lecture today is titled Brexit and National Conservatism. So Professor Calhoun, we very much look forward to listening to you.
Well, thank you, Professor Zappettini, and greetings to everybody on the course. It's terrific to be with you. Thank you, Aziz, for arranging my presence here. I hope to speak for about 30 minutes, which probably means I will speak for a little bit more than 30 minutes, but I will try to control myself. And I'm going to try to travel back in time and center the talks about Brexit, but very much in line with the good introduction from Professor Zappettini. I will suggest Brexit is not just a moment, but a phase in much longer processes. And I will talk a bit about what came before and what is coming after as well, and try to situate this within some frame of thinking about populism. I won't engage in comparative analysis, but we'll try to raise some questions which can indeed be considered in more comparative ways. Let me bring up my screen. And now, Zoom, where are we here? The PowerPoint. I've hidden my PowerPoint from myself. That's a problem. There we go. Okay. So, Brexit. The first thing I want to stress, Professor Zappettini has already said in a way, is that this shocking event of 2016 is on a longer path, is shaped by precedents, and was, at least in part, more foreseeable than it seemed. It was greeted as an enormous shock. On the night of the Brexit referendum, I was hosting and chairing an election watching forum at the LSE. We had several hundred professors, students, and people from the public gathered in an auditorium to watch the results come in, the vast majority of whom, I think, expected no Brexit to happen. And so it was a shock to them that it did. At various points during the evening, some people declared they thought Brexit was happening, but many people went to bed at 1 or 2 in the morning, still not clear what the result was, or still fairly confident that the result would be Britain remaining in the EU. The fact that it was such a shock may indicate that people hadn't looked as well at the polls as they should. Simon Hicks, a prominent political scientist on one of those forums, did indeed early on make some prediction that this would happen, but I think it's safe to say it wasn't expected. Even its supporters didn't clearly expect it. At around 10 in the evening or 11 in the evening, supporters of Brexit, including Nigel Farage, appeared interviewed by the BBC on television, saying something on the order of, "We gave it a good shot, it's too bad it didn't work," only an hour or 2 later to begin rolling back their words and trying to change it. So Brexit is embedded in paths of various lengths and in a very broad context as well as specific British politics. Like all big events, it's shaped by highly contingent circumstances. I will mention, for example, things like deciding to have the two choices be called leave and remain, which many people think biased the decision in favor of the active leave against the passive remain, or the relatively casual way in which David Cameron called for the referendum. There were differentially effective mobilizations. This is shaped, like all mobilizations, by things like money and the availability of funding for the campaign for Brexit. It's shaped by how seriously people took this. Many on the Remain side did not campaign really energetically or effectively through much of the movement. So we can't see this just as a question of attitudes. It's a question of campaigns. And then there are issues about deeper shifts in political alignments that I'll mention, and that are particularly interesting to think about today with the new election results and the massive swing towards Labour. Finally, this shock, this failure to anticipate that this could really happen, was not just accidental, I think. It wasn't just that people weren't paying attention, but that in many ways people were locked into ways of looking at politics and Britain and Europe and national identity that made them not want to see the signs of what was in fact happening. And that has behind it, I'll suggest, things like a geography. People in London not seeing the rest of the country as well as they might. It's worth noting that a few months later, when the US elected Donald Trump, there was a similar dynamic. Despite fairly considerable evidence of how well Trump was doing, despite fairly considerable evidence of how well Trump was doing, the number of people who just couldn't bring themselves to consider this possibility was large. Let me go into it. First, European integration itself is a long story, and I could have made it longer. There just weren't enough lines on the PowerPoint. Right? There are a lot of steps. There's a long prehistory. I won't spend much time on it, but it's worth recognizing that in at least a plausible narrative, the process that becomes European unification begins after the Napoleonic Wars, or with the Napoleonic Wars. That this continues as various states and empires try to work out peace. It's worth mentioning because Europe has basically a century of internal peace through the 19th century. European countries are not necessarily peaceful in their relations to the rest of the world, in the race for Africa and other colonial ventures, but Europe is engaged in constant diplomacy and efforts to work out agreements to hold the country together, to hold the continent together. These in some part fall apart from the late 19th century through both world wars. I think you could consider a period from the one or another date in the late 19th century, the 1890s, through 1945 as one long period of a kind of interregnum in which there was not stable power, in which what had been the integrative forces of Europe failed, and what you got was unbridled imperialism and a race for Africa and fighting with each other over colonies, 2 world wars, and a Great Depression. Right? So a long period, not just World War II, but a long period of destabilization, during which a variety of policy analysts, including John Maynard Keynes, famously said that the problem here is disunity in Europe. It is that the countries are not working out a unifying process. They are necessarily connected to each other, but not managing the connections. After the war, the process of unification was taken up with an initial intention to ensure peace as a primary goal by ensuring interdependence in key industries. The European coal and steel community was indicative. This was expanded into the European Economic Community and then into the European Union. And there were various restatements, restructurings of the terms of European Union on the way, along with an expanded mission, by which I mean this was no longer just industrial interdependence in order to secure peace, but it became a broader mission with things like the Erasmus scheme and educational integration, with efforts to try to reshape curricula in schools, with regulation of a variety of kinds, with a humanitarian organization important in the world, with the concern for the environment growing. And so Europe began to project in various positive ways, not just its hope to avoid war, but hope to have a better world. There was a striking moment in 2005 when European elites thought that a set of referenda to ratify a new basic law and a stronger European Union would pass, but were defeated in several countries. The British referendum that was scheduled did not take place because defeats elsewhere, notably France, in a period of 2 weeks before it, meant that it had become a moot point. Right? And then enlargement took place in a couple of waves over a long period of time. Right? So the EU is integrating, but shifting its character, and this mattered. This European unification, I think, can be understood as a double movement in the sense of Karl Polanyi, a major social and political theorist and economic and social historian, who talked about the extent to which disruptive changes demand reaction. But disruptive change doesn't dictate the path of reaction. So, for example, the Industrial Revolution produced in a long arc of history the welfare state. It produced trade unions and other things Polanyi considered positive reactions. It also produced destitution and vagrancy. It produced crime. It produced a housing crisis. It produced a variety of problems. And he suggested it produced fascism. That much of what produced the crisis of the world wars was, in fact, an attempt to manage what had been set in motion by the Industrial Revolution and the coming of capitalism. Fascism was a sort of perverse effort to save a disrupted society, to claim and provide security, and to guarantee future power, which has, I'm going to come back to at the end, some analogs to aspects of so-called national conservatism today. So European unification continued always as a dialectical process, right? Responding to modern state formation and capitalism alongside war and welfare states, advancing in certain ways, shifting in others, always to be analyzed, for example, in its different dimensions as well as its commonality. For example, the EU did much better at securing the mobility of capital than at securing the mobility of labor. For all of the talk of EU migrants and labor migrants, capital, finance, flowed much more easily across national boundaries and built up a growing range of large businesses. Now, what about Britain's path that pursues Brexit? It's worth recalling, as not everybody did at the time of Brexit, that Britain tried to join for years only to be blocked by France. Britain was the first country to associate with the European coal and steel community, and then with the larger project of the European Economic Community. It applied twice for membership and was vetoed by France. It had majority support from the member states, but not General de Gaulle. It finally entered the EU in 1973 and then reaffirmed this in 1975 in a further vote, right? So there's a background here, which is not just Britain wanting to be in the club and for various reasons being excluded. There's another story. There's the story of Britain's loss of its empire. So Britain was not just a separate country to be considered as an island off Europe. It was a country with a worldwide empire, the largest and most successful global empire. This It began to lose in the 20th century and with gathering speed after World War II. So at the same moment that there was this anxiety about avoiding future European conflicts, Britain was beginning to try to come to terms with the loss of empire. There was an issue, a running issue, of the relationship of England to the rest of the UK. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland actually incorporates multiple countries, and the multiple countries have somewhat different character, culture, national agendas, politics, histories. They have, among other things, a characteristic of having been conquered by England. So it's not just that there was a multinational country, but that it owed something to conquest. England is by far the largest and the dominant member, but others had their own significant claims and pride. Scotland, in particular, this isn't the time to go into the story, had, if anything, prospered more than England from the British Empire. And the loss of the empire was problematic for Scotland, which had played big roles in imperial administration and helped to foreshadow changes. Another change was the rise of labor. The earlier attempts to join the EU had been led by conservatives. It was Prime Minister Heath who fought hardest, perhaps, but a number of conservative leaders to join the EU because it was seen as crucial to Britain's economic fortunes. The rise of labor after the war, especially in the 60s, brought a different voice for unification. So in the immediate rise of labor after World War II, this is less of an issue that was there. And at all points, the desire of labor as effectively a social democratic and/or socialist party on the border of these two as they exist in European terms was to ally with its fellow labor parties, its workers' parties, at a scale comparable to capital. So an issue for labor in Britain, as for socialism on the continent, was for workers to be organized at the same scale that finance capital was organized. If it was more global, they needed a wider reach. It was also a modernizing agenda because building the welfare state had become a primary post-war agenda everywhere, and it too was thought to be interdependent, as the issues of higher education suggest. There were issues of geopolitics in the Cold War, the ban the bomb movement, the range of challenges posed by the heating up at various points of the Cold War, as in the Berlin conflict, and a desire to have Europeans, including Brits, stand together against the threats of the Cold War. This was mostly about the concerns of communism and linked to anti-communism, but it always had an element of trying to make sure that the West and the anti-communist NATO allies were not completely dominated by the United States. So one of the agendas for European unification was to make the European voice or voices stronger in relation to the Americans, as well as to make the West stronger in relationship to its challengers. And then during the latter part of the 20th century, especially after the 1970s, there was an intensification of global trade, what we tend to just call globalization. That's a misleading term because there's been globalization all along, but this became an era in which people talked a lot about globalization. And with it came migration and cultural flows and questions about how to position Britain. New Labour, as it came to power, had an agenda for Cool Britannia, leading the path of globalization, putting Britain at the center of a more global world. In other words, just making this work for Britain. But it did, in many ways, work for Britain. The glaring example is the financial industry. London became the most important financial hub in the world. This brought considerable profits to Britain. It made Britain attractive for a kind of migrant that isn't the one who is usually caricatured in Brexit campaigns, which would talk about the Polish plumber or other working class migrants. Here it was finance industry professionals, some of them coming by way of the LSE, who became key to the investment banking world, which is a very international, very cosmopolitan world. I don't have time to go back to the story, but it always has been. Back to the Rothschilds in the early modern period, on through the heyday of imperialism in the 19th century to the current period. Of all capitalists, the finance industry has been the most cosmopolitan. And it chose London as its core base, aided in part by policies of new labor and restructuring. And this brought huge prosperity to London. As I'll come back to, it didn't extend to the rest of the country as much. But it wasn't just finance. There were a variety of design industries, tourism and cultural industries, and Britain's considerable success as a global education provider with many of the world's top universities and lots of international students. So the project of globalization wasn't just a project of capitalist elites, it was a wider project, but it was an imbalanced project. It's one that actually went pretty much according to plan for the Blairites, though their plans hadn't necessarily considered the disaffection of the people who were not benefiting from it. Other nations had partially similar mixes of challenges and positive movement in this, double movement in the Polanyi sense, a dialectic of forward and backwards and sideways. There were a variety of payoffs to growth, and this was an era of high growth rates, right? But very uneven distribution. So almost everywhere in the rich world, including in Britain, inequality increased dramatically. The only large capitalist country for which this is not true is France, where it increased a little bit, but not dramatically. But in general, throughout all the OECD countries, there's a rapid increase in inequality. I'm not going to show you charts, and I'm going to hope that the reality of this is familiar. But inequality of income, where there was something of a hollowing out of the middle, but a tremendous range of positions, but even more inequality of wealth, where the amount owned by the top 1% or even top 0.1% became huge. This had implications for geographical reorganization, which were basic to Brexit. In Britain, as in other countries, there were shifts in balances between rural and urban areas, between industrial regions and others. Subsidies were used. For example, France invested massively in subsidies to rural areas to try to maintain a high quality of life for peasants. And ultimately, not especially successfully, as you may witness the last dozen or so years of yellow vests and other rural protests, the use of subsidies was passed over to the EU. So from the point of view of the anti-EU forces who have become important in Brexit, part of the story is that the EU was making British people and everybody else pay for subsidies to French farmers and other farmers, because there was an effort to manage the unsettling growth of cities, growth of industry, growth of capitalist businesses. The British choice had been to have relatively minimal agricultural subsidies, essentially pushing people out of farming into industry and into cities and then into other occupations. So Britain was classically the country of liberalism, although some others eventually overtook it, in the European sense of liberalism, meaning a regime of relatively low economic support for the society. Whoops. The Cold War had its own impact on all of this, among other things, occasioning part of the enlargement of the EU at the end of the Cold War. The ends of colonialism did, shaping migration. And one of the peculiarities of the Brexit debates is that everybody who talked about migration talked about it as though European migration was basic, but what they were often upset about was post-colonial migration from other parts of the world. All of this happened with a new spirit of egalitarianism after World War II, articulating the idea of great equality, but frustrating people by maintaining structures of hierarchical incorporation, such as those the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu had analyzed in education, that there might be less direct influence of wealth, but it would matter more and more what education you got to determine a life chance, and that in turn would be shaped by family background. There was also a durable transformation of the political right, what would eventually come to be called national conservatism today, but the right didn't go away. It was marginalized in much of the politics. There were conservatives, but the far right was marginalized, but it would begin to come back in a significant story that shaped this. Now, let's get to the heart of Brexit, the timing of it. What happens that makes for this rupture in 2016? Right? I've just told you there are some long and powerful reasons many Britons want to join, and some Britons are frustrated. The ones who want to join are disproportionately tied, not surprisingly, to those who are benefiting from trends of globalization. Well, what happens? There's the massive financial crisis of 2008, 9, 10, and in fact, a terrible and ill-conceived austerity program of the British government after it. So in the years leading up to Brexit, there's been a huge financial crisis, which is clearly seen as not just British. To some extent, it was produced in America and spread around the world. It was a crisis of the global financial system, and so it was seen as almost an outside attack. As another matter of timing, a referendum on Scottish independence nearly passed in 2014. It didn't pass, but it set a model of trying to settle a basic constitutional question by a referendum. So the 2016 Brexit referendum was in part an imitation of it. It reassured David Cameron in particular and other leaders that the change wouldn't pass. It annoyed English people who resented Scotland wanting to leave, and it angered Scottish people because they didn't get the chance to leave. So it rocked the landscape. 2015 was the worst year for an immigration crisis, in many ways hit on the continent harder and drove other wedges that would become significant in the post-Brexit years when tensions between Southern and Northern Europe, Eastern and Western Europe would become more acute on the migration crisis. But the 2015 year was horrendous, with people dying, trying to get from Africa to Italy or Greece, dying trying to get from Syria to Europe, dying trying to get across the English Channel from France to Britain. And so immigration was on the mind, right? Independent of just specific local examples. It wasn't necessarily that there was somebody taking your place in a factory nearby. It was a big public issue too. And alongside it came a wave of bombings that made the time feel very insecure, particularly in Europe. There were a series of major bombings in European cities, in France in particular, tied to this and to a fear of Islam. The year before the referendum, the Conservative Party won a landslide victory. I can hardly remember now that it has had the benefit of that landslide victory for 9 years, squandered it, and is now in its worst state since then. But it won a big victory. Both the Labour Party and the Liberals were in disarray after it. The Liberals were wondering if their party could continue to exist. It had gotten so small. Labour had divisive leadership contests and a hard time coming together in a big fight between the left and its so-called center, huge fights over anti-Semitism, a series of problems. Right? In the campaign that led to the Conservative victory of 2015, Prime Minister Cameron rather carelessly and casually promised to hold a referendum. What he was doing was placating his right, the farther right parts of the Tory party, and the nationalist right that was gaining expression in the UK Independence Party, UKIP, including Nigel Farage, its leader, who were drivers ultimately of Brexit, proposing it. And he said, okay, we'll have a referendum, kind of not imagining it would pass, and not thinking it through very well. this resulted in some of the very planning disasters of it. The Brexit campaign comes, and this is somewhat to the surprise of David Cameron and others. There was a big, organized, well-funded campaign to manage public consciousness and opinion and convince people to leave the European Union. The Remain forces, those who wanted to stay in the European Union, had a very poor campaign by comparison, partly because of party differences, right? You couldn't get the key labor leaders and the key conservative leaders together. You couldn't get figures like Gordon Brown on the same stage with some of the others from the centrist parties. The management, moreover, was simply bad and lazy. It was just poorly run, as well as having ideological conflicts. By contrast, the Brexit campaign was well-funded. It had a number of wealthy donors. Curiously, a couple of the most important of them from the gambling industry, so they were placing a bet on Brexit, who paid for all sorts of advertising. Some of the most visible was on buses, as I'm illustrating here. And it had not just attitudes, it had falsehoods, but powerfully communicative falsehoods. We send the EU 350 million pounds a week. Let's fund the National Health Service instead. So here's the National Health Service, a long-standing British nationalist treasure, built in part by the Labour Party, in large part, and all that. And the claim is we are sacrificing this to the EU. There were problems in the NHS, perhaps exaggerated, but what was false was the idea that Britain sent the EU 350 million a week, ignoring all the things Britain received back from the EU. So it was simply a manipulative campaign in various ways. It intersected left-right politics. It had a big media role, and because of that, a big need for money. So it was shaped by that. Immigration was perhaps the single biggest issue in it for most people, at least in public terms. Some, like the one in the top left, were saying that Britain should not be panicked by immigration, but there was a huge anxiety about it. It was a bit odd. In fact, EU migration, net migration, was not the biggest factor in migration in Britain, nor the most unsettling, but it was a concern. And immigration had genuinely increased. So one of the problems was that many on the left who should have been making a case for how much Britain depended on immigrants, for example, as staff of the National Health Service, were instead saying it was just illegitimate to raise the question of immigration to people who could feel that it was a pressing question. And the media joined in constantly with a barrage of headlines, making people anxious about immigration. The political demography of all of this and of the result is interesting and reflects this as I get into the last stage as it happens here. I'm not bothering to tell you much of the story. You know what happens at one level. Right? Brexit wins. Well, how does it win? Right? It takes all the blue territory on that map and it loses by fairly large margins often in the yellow territory, right? Scotland, much of Ireland, the south around London, right? So this is a very divided country. Take it back, urban and rural, right? The declining industrial regions. The big shock to the Labour Party was that, in effect, it lost what had been its heartlands, where people were there. But that was partly because New Labour had been a project of remaking the Labour Party with young urban professionals at its core, instead of working class unionists in the regions of declining industry. And this set up a split. And it was a split in part over whether British identity or English identity really mattered and how. The stories of Scotland and Ireland have their local issues and complications. Scottish independence is advanced in part by its relative wealth from oil resources, except that that flows to Britain as a whole. So there's a thought, could we keep the North Sea oil? In Ireland, there's always the issue of unification, but also the fact that the violent conflicts in Ireland had been resolved, or at least brought into abeyance, by a partial integration of trade, so that people in Ireland could, in fact, and Northern Ireland, the British part, could in fact relate well to each other. Goods and services and people could flow back and forth across the boundary. And passing Brexit meant reinstituting a sharp boundary between the two Irelands, because one was in EU. Right? I'm not going to go through all the lines in this chart, but just point out that the vote splits in some significant ways. Workers with no advanced educational qualifications are more than 3/4 in support of Brexit. Whether there is any clear path between Brexit and better economic lives for them, whether that's going to bring back manufacturing or unions, is another question. By contrast, people with postgraduate degrees, and in general, young people thinking towards the future more positively, professionals, all vote in favor of remaining in the EU. So there's a divided Britain, but it's less divided just about Europe than about its own political economy. And Europe has been made a way of focusing on this. English nationalism was a big deal in the back to this. But note, not British nationalism, English nationalism. In the era of the British Empire, there was increasing British identity, right? Here, the key mobilization was of English identity, the English Defence League, separate from Scotland, Ireland, but also from foreigners to Britain, right? Promotion of Englishness is central. This is part of what foreshadows the development of national conservatism. It was already a phase in what has now become an international movement of nationalists. In all the countries of Europe, in the United States, in other places, right? Nationalists coupling their nationalism to conservatism on a variety of cultural issues and hostility to immigrants, and feeling that liberal political elites have simply had contempt for their concerns for their countries, a key part of the background of populism. This is a coupling of conservatism, conservation, with something more counter-revolutionary, a willingness to break things out of anger that there's been so much deterioration. And this was important in Brexit. There was not just a rational argument, getting out of the EU will get you your job back if you've lost it. There was an emotional feeling of anger over what had happened in Britain that was being expressed this way. And it was focused in some very considerable part on London. People in the rest of Britain were angry at London, and London was the part of Britain committed to the EU. So the national conservatives around the world are pioneered in some part by Nigel Farage there, as always with his mouth open. And we see versions of a similar sort of argument being made in a variety of different places. An anti-immigrant argument, an argument about defending the nation, defending the more traditional cultural ways of the nation as they are defined by certain elites, but always in the background also an economic argument. Right? And since then, there's been an issue of practical implementation. I don't know if you can even see Theresa May. I can't. The pictures from the Zoom call cover her up there, holding hands with Donald Trump. So starting in 2016, Brexit vote has happened. And the mantra for British politicians was, we're now going to complete Brexit. We're going to really do it. We're going to put it in place. No small feat. So these 4 different conservative prime ministers passed through number 10 Downing Street, having difficulty getting Brexit done in various ways. Even the last one, Rishi Sunak, right, comes into office saying all legislation linked to the EU will go off the books expiring in 2023. Well, it doesn't. They then change. What's up? Well, Britain hasn't decided what it meant by Brexit, right? Brexit connection to the EU involved thousands, literally thousands of laws, something like 4,900 different laws, and then tens of thousands of specific written policies under each of those laws, having to do with various terms of economic relationships. So it was a lot of work. The clearest winners in Brexit are the lawyers who get hired to rewrite the laws. But in any case, it's a big task. So even if you're for Brexit, it's a daunting task, and repeated prime ministers keep finding it hard to follow through. This is partly negotiations, and Europe turns out to be somewhat harder to negotiate with than they thought. They thought the Europeans would just back over. But things like the Irish free trade question. Was there now going to be a boundary between Britain outside of the EU and the customs union of the EU, such that all sorts of Irish trade with Britain, trade between Northern Ireland and Britain, would have to be reorganized, as well as trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, because of where the boundaries would go. So there are hard questions. Strangely, Theresa May, the prime minister in red, who's being slightly obscured by the pictures here, triggered Article 50 of the agreement and basically set a deadline for accomplishing all of Brexit without knowing what she was after. So again, a sort of contingent accident. There was then vastly more work, and it still goes on. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, will have to deal with this more, what to do. There are a bunch of illusions that came to the fore, and Britain became increasingly depressed as it realized they were illusions. Like, we're sending money to the EU. When we have that money at home, we'll be richer. Or the Commonwealth will save us. Once we're out of the EU, former British colonies will want to trade mainly with Britain. Trade with India will really boost us. India is a growing economy. Well, trade with India hasn't boosted Britain very much. India is trading with a variety of others in the world and not being especially loyal to its former colonial master. And there's just endless damage to mitigate. Finally, this, of course, spreads into the EU. There aren't just ramifications for Britain, there are ramifications for the rest of the EU, temptations for others to consider similar paths, and a new organization of left-right politics throughout the EU. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Calhoun, for this great lecture.